tyrannical empire bent on the conquest of all the galaxy has to offer, or benevolent meritocracy with a divine edict from its gods to shepherd all life to its eventual destiny. No matter which of these you prefer, you have to respect the Dominion. Devoutly faithful, militarily brilliant, they are, at current, the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. And it's hard not to think of them as the bad guys. I mean, 5 out of 10 Orin agree that the Dominion are evil and must be stopped. On the other hand, the other 5 weren't able to answer our poll because they're dead or starving on their Dominion-occupied homeworld. But to understand the complexities of the Dominion, we need to go back to its roots, before it was made up of 90% Chua and 10% Emperor. The story of the Dominion takes us back to a time before there was, a Dominion at all. It begins on an unremarkable planet orbiting an unremarkable star, Cassis. This planet gives rise to a race of humans called Cassians. They're pretty much your standard human race. I mean, just look at a mirror, that's what they look like. They're fairly intelligent, they're fairly ambitious, they are the vanilla humans of the Wildstar universe. And these Cassians lived under a group of nations called the Cassian Commonwealth. But things are not going so well for these Cassians. They have stripped their world bare of resources through centuries of warfare. Trisane Toria has a journal which references food riots within the Commonwealth, which are definitely not a symptom of a healthy society. People are starving and resources are thin. There's really only one thing to do. The nations of the Commonwealth begin work on a singular project, the Nomad, a recon vessel to be sent off into the stars to find new worlds for the Cassians to colonize, and new resources for them to exploit. This would be the greatest project in the Commonwealth's history. The Nomad was a starship that took a century to design and build. Its crew was handpicked, and nearly 100 years before the rise of the Dominion, it departed Cassis into the void of space. And during this voyage, nearly a year after its departure, the Nomad would detect something incredible. A stellar force giving off the energy of 1 trillion supernova every second. After this short debate and the murder of an unfortunate crew member, they sped off towards this strange anomaly. And we're wandering into speculative territory here, so Pappy and the Wildstar lore team, you are more than welcome to correct me here, but I do believe that the Nomad had discovered Nexus, or at least Nexus under construction. And as such, probably got vaporized by Elden defense turrets. They are not super stoked on people walking in on their experiments. While this event would put many gears in motion, meanwhile on Cassis the Nomad was kind of written off as a failure. It was forgotten and replaced with a slower, more iterative method for colonization. They built colony fleets which would step out slowly onto the galactic stage and begin a new conquest of the stars, new colonies on new worlds, and more importantly, new resources. This brought all kinds of prosperity to Cassis. New resources coming from its new colonies, the Cassians saw a resurgence of their society. This wasn't so true at the frontier, where work was incredibly hard and grueling, and the fruits of your labor were often sent back to the homeworld. So naturally, this is going to breed a little bit of unrest. This environment of unrest, uprisings, and rebellion gives rise to a rather interesting figure, Trisane Toria. Toria was a legendary blade mistress. She's both capable, loyal, and willing. She was well known for quelling rebellions and warlords and enemies of the state who appeared during this time. She was commander of the Cassian fleet, and a warrior without equal. With over 8,000 military victories and 600 victories in personal combat, she suffered not a single defeat. This, of course, drew some rather unexpected attention to her. You see, while all this was happening, the Elden, probably somewhat annoyed that the Nomad had run right into their Nexus installation, were considering how to deal with the Cassians and their now interstellar expansion. It may only be a matter of time before more Cassians started bumping into Nexus, and really they didn't want this to happen. I mean, the Nexus project is extremely sensitive. So they devised a plan: unconscious submission or obliteration. The Makari were sent, the servitor race of the Elden, to the Cassians, roughly 34 years before the birth of the Dominion. They landed amid the awe of the Cassian people who had never seen a species so technologically superior to them, and made a simple demand. We are the Makari, emissaries of the glorious and powerful Elden. Trisane Toria must accompany us to our world, and in return, your race will rule the universe. Should you decline this honor, you will be eradicated. Make your choice. Those words were actually spoken by a fairly familiar face, Axis Fedra, the Makari ambassador of the Dominion in the modern era and messenger of the Elden then. And technically she wasn't an Axis because the Axis title kind of came about later, I guess. Maybe, I don't know if that's true. After this rousing round of diplomacy by the plasma cannon, Toria capitulated, and her and roughly 100 of her sword maidens left with the Makari. They would later become the sword maidens we actually find in Wildarun, and the Sanctuary of the Sword Maiden dungeon. In fact, Toria is still alive. That's largely thanks to the primeval Vitaria. The Sword Maiden and her entourage left, on the back of the Imperial promise that the Cassians would rule the galaxy. The Elden had chosen their proxy race, to manipulate through the Dominion leadership, both to keep them away from Nexus, and to build a giant galaxy-spanning sphere of control. Well, I mean, that really was the plan until, well, Omna, I didn't see you there. But true to their plan, the Elden experimented on many of the humans, and through Toria's genes created the first Elden-human hybrid, Dominus. Their gift to the Cassians, the strength, will, and leadership to forge a galactic empire. And 34 years after Torian was taken from the Cassian Commonwealth, and a century since the launch of the Nomad, Dominus arrived on Cassis. He brought with him incredible technologies, charisma and strength unbound by the Cassian physiology. He brought the word of the Elden, their benefactor, and that they had been chosen. The Cassians were to rule the galaxy, a true Elden-human hybrid known as Illumini. Dominus the Half-Blood did not take long to win over his new subjects, and thus was born the Dominion. The new calendar year, 1 AE. So after this point, things start to speed up, which is a good thing because I'm already 3 pages into this script and have 1665 years left to cover. Ugh. The Dominion entered into a golden age. They saw technological advancement like they never could have imagined. The Empire grew by leaps and bounds under the guidance of the Makari and the leadership of the Emperor. Unfortunately, Dominus was still mortal. And in the end, after 300 years of leadership, Dominus passed away. Dominus would go to have 6 children before he passed away. These children were known as the Scions and would become a large part of the Vigilant Church nearly 1,300 years later. These Scions were Azrion the Conqueror, the Scion of Strength and a Master Warrior, Tristan the Valiant, whose courage was unshaking, Bronos the Just, who enforced the law and doled just punishment, Galen the Adept, whose knowledge knew no equal, Avindra the Righteous, whose compassion extended to all, and Coral the Devoted, who believed in the Dominion's singular purpose. Not to be mistaken with Coral the Shaper of the Elden, who was the only Elden with common sense. Azrion was next in line for the throne, and continued his father's work fostering the Empire and growing its borders, mostly through conquest or some really great diplomacy, the kind of diplomacy where you walk onto a planet, offer them submission, or threaten them with obliteration. Axis Fedra, who at this point is actually an Axis because the ICI is a thing that exists, decided that they needed a shock troop race to join the Dominion, and made a decision with the Draken, a warrior race from the molten planet of Mikros. The Draken were humanoids with rough, leathery skin, long tails, and horns, and engaged in many blood rituals. They were incredibly brutal as a race, and warlike, destructive creatures, usually things you wouldn't associate with civilization. And the Draken were made up of many clans who often fought between each other, but were ruled by a clan lord, acting as the leader. Azrion arrived on Mikros after years of studying its people, their customs, and languages. And instead of subjecting everyone to a long and brutal war of conquest, invoked a Draken ritual custom. He challenged Zur, the reigning clan lord, to a duel for rulership of their two races. For nearly 10 hours, the two of them fought. And mind you, this is Illumini, and not a distant one. He's only 2 steps away from the Elden themselves. The son of Dominus, who was a man who could split a building in half with his greatsword. And yet, they ground each other to a near stalemate. Zur was clearly a badass of incredible proportions, worthy of the Dominion. In the end, both of them were beaten to within inches of death, the fight nearly having been called on both sides. But finally, Azrion struck true and decapitated Zur. The Draken were slack-jawed, struck by the awe of the battle and its victor. After nearly 10 hours, Azrion choked out the words, "Welcome to the Dominion," assumedly before he returned to his ship and collapsed. Azrion would survive to continue to rule, but yeah, that sounds like it was a good fight. You would think this would have painted the Draken as a somewhat disloyal race, but you would be wrong. Their warrior culture idolized Azrion to the point where Draken charms actually are a resemblance of his helmet. But it would be 200 years before Axis Phaedra would commit one of the most contentious decisions in Dominion history. On a backwater planet called Bezgalore, a verdant green world teeming with primitive life forms, the Makari ambassador gave her usual speech to the primitive and tribal Chua. The Chua were a small and rodent-like race known for both being mechanical savants and also for being clinically insane. But at this time, they were primitive. They were a race of savages wearing little more than bones and leaves. So Phaedra saw fit to provide the nascent Chua with the Cosmodron, a device designed to impart ideas of technological advancement within the Chua, things like basic principles of physics and mechanics. Not entirely satisfied with the Chua, she departed, after receiving a gift that would start a long-term irritation with the tiny rat bastards. And for a century, nobody really cared. They continued to go on their way. It wasn't until Phaedra returned to the planet that she realized the true scope of the Chua's ingenuity. In a century, they had transformed the verdant Bezgalore into an industrial nightmare. The air was choked with toxic pollutants. The horizon was crowded with factories. Massive superstructures and manufacturing districts dotted the landscape. Amazed by the incredible breadth of their advancement in such a small time frame, Phaedra brought the Chua into the Dominion, with the promises of more worlds to reap for resources. The psychotic furballs were unleashed upon the galaxy. For good, or, if you ask the Auran, probably for ill. Following the uplift of the Chua, the Dominion faced its first ever military failure in their loss of the war for Nox, the homeworld of the Granok. But this was overshadowed by a much darker event. Phaedra and the others received a message from the Elden that carried with it strange and potentially dark portents. Today we have reached the unattainable. Soon we shall seize the power of gods. Followed by silence. The Elden had ascended to godhood, and this changed everything. The Dominion's admiration of the Elden turned to worship in the form of the Vigilant Church. Chronicle houses that had stood for centuries were torn down to make room for new holy structures. The holy book, the Vigilant Codex, was penned by Emperor Jarek himself. Those with Elden blood became divine, a class above, and it's around this time that we see the rise of the Highborn and the Lowborn, a factor that will directly contribute to the creation of the Exiles. The Dominion was rife with conflict, drawn into a war with a rebellious exile force, until one faithful day, the discovery of Nexus, nearly 300 years later. Though the Exiles were the ones to actually find the planet, the Dominion wasted no time in colonization, immediately constructing the city of Ilium on its surface and bringing in thousands of colonists to begin to tame the untamed world of the Elden, their benefactors, their gods. And this is where we see the Dominion today, quickly militarizing to conquer this planet. So what is life in the Dominion like? Well, it can be kind of tough or it can be great depending on where you live. It largely is supposed to exist as a meritocracy. You are judged based on your merit, though there are some exceptions to this rule. Society is split into two different strata, the Lowborn and the Highborn. The Highborn are those who can trace their lineage back to one of the 7 great Lumini houses, and therefore have some small percentage of Elden blood in their veins. And the Lowborn are basically everybody else. Despite its nomenclature and the inherent inequality of the Lumini being better than the Lowborn, Lowborn are treated fairly well in most of the Empire. They are given status and judged on their merit. Tyrants is an example of a Lowborn who has risen his status up to be one of the most powerful men in the Empire. This line does tend to blur though. Nexus is far from home, and some Lumini have taken some liberties over their Lowborn subjects. The Dominion does provide things like welfare and healthcare and education depending on where you are, with charity for the less fortunate coming from the Vigilant Church, which is the primary form of worship within the Dominion. The current Dominion is led by Emperor Mercalus, although there seems to be some questions as to whether he is in fact still alive, as he hasn't really made a personal appearance within the game yet. He's just been a hologram. Despite this, he is well loved and considered by some to be the second coming of Dominus. There are a number of important institutions on Nexus as well that belong to the Dominion. Namely, we have the Legions of the Dominion, the Vigilant Church, Dredd, the Dominion Research and Experimentation Division, and the ICI, the Imperial Corps of Intelligence. The Dominion military is divided up into many legions, each comprised of 50,000 soldiers. Each legion has a rich heritage, and often they date back hundreds of years. Many legions, such as the Crimson Legion and the Radiant Legion, have been fighting on Nexus for years now. The Dominion legions on Nexus are led by Kesrek Warbringer, a Draken of incredible martial and tactical prowess, who murdered his way to the top, killing the previous Supreme Commander of the Dominion forces, although it wasn't an honor duel to preserve said Supreme Commander's honor. Kesrek is incredibly dangerous and has a keen eye for weakness. He definitely knows when to press his advantage, and he is a Draken not to be messed with. The Vigilant Church makes up a massive part of the Dominion presence on Nexus. Formed shortly after the Elden ascended to godhood nearly 300 years before the discovery of Nexus, the Church is the primary source for worship and charity. Within the Dominion, they worship the Elden as gods, and the Scions as the essentially prophets of those gods, as well as Dominus the Half-Blood. The Church also has a military arm called the Radiant Legion, commanded by Torek Antivian, a legendary warrior who raised himself up from lowborn status to command the Church's military wing. His brother, Calidor, may or may not have fallen into one of Zarkonis' recombination devices and become an augmented human, who now leads a faction of augmented zealots, who you can find in Whitevale and other places on the planet. They might be a problem one day. Let's hope not. Next up, we have Dredd, the scientific wing of the Dominion, on Nexus at least. The Dominion Research and Experimentation Division are responsible for studying and advancing Dominion technology, as well as uncovering Elden secrets and all sorts of other things you'd find from a, scientific organization. They're led by the jovially planet-killing Mondo Zax, who, aside from being one of the most intelligent Chua alive, is responsible for an uncountable number of deaths. He spearheaded the reaping of Arborea, which has probably killed untold thousands of people. And finally, we have the ICI, the Imperial Corps of Intelligence. These are your James Bond types, spies, covert agents, and surveillance experts who are responsible for keeping tabs on people like the Exiles and other enemies of state. They are led by the wonderfully charismatic Axis Phaedra, who is most notably known for walking onto planets and then offering obliteration or submission. She's a very good diplomat, and also a very good spy master. But that is the Dominion of the current day. A good overview of what the Dominion is really like. It's tough to really see them as they are through all the marketing. They are definitely painted to be the bad guys. In the end, it's up to you to decide whether they are mustache-twirling villains or simply a force for order guided by a divine hand. So what'll it be? Submission or obliteration? Hey guys, thanks for checking out this second episode in a 4-part miniseries on Wildstar lore. I love Wildstar lore, so I thought I'd just do a thing on it. It gives me an excuse to read a bunch of lore on Wildstar, which I love to do. This one ran a little bit long. Holy crap, there is a lot of material on the Dominion. I'm not gonna lie to you, this Wildstar team has put a lot of effort into this. Pappy, you are not making this easy on me, but I love you. Thank you. Very good work. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've also done one on the Elden, which is the first part, and the next episode will be on the Exiles, everybody's lovable scamps. And I'll talk about a bunch of the lore sections that I kind of left out with them. But thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoyed this. You all have a great one. Phaedra, Miraculous. Miraculous? Mycalius? I don't know.